As I approach retirement, I realize that the nearly 50 years I've been in general internal medicine primary care practice, the last quarter of the 20th and the first quarter of the 21st century, these have been a historic period for medical practice. So I thought I would try to put together a presentation capturing my experience as a primary care internist during this period. When I finished residency training, I remember one of my fellow residents who was about to do a subspecialty fellowship. He commented that he hoped my career as a generalist wouldn't be boring. I can say now, not boring. Recently, I was rummaging around in my basement and I happened to find my seventh grade report card. And I'll show it to you because I think it gives some insights on my future career possibilities. You can see in the top arrow that I was pretty good in science. I was B plus A minus student. And so I think that showed I had good potential um, for medicine or science. Um, but I also didn't do so well. I also will point out that the other arrow is I was satisfactory all the way through in health. Um, but I will also point out that I didn't do so well in industrial arts or physical education, which suggests that I did not have much of a future as a carpenter or a professional athlete. When I was in high school, I was fortunate enough to go to the University of Chicago Biomedical Career Conference 2 years in a row. And it was just fascinating. We went around to the labs where they were doing medical research. We heard what clinicians were doing. And then we had presentations. And one presentation I really remember recently, they had just discovered the cause of sickle cell anemia, which is a horrible disease that leads to a short lifetime of misery. And they discovered that there was one genetic mutation and one amino acid substitution to cause the hemoglobin to sickle and to cause this disease. And as it turns out, I thought this was fascinating. And as it turns out, that many years later, they have actually been able to do genetic engineering and they now have a cure for sickle cell disease. But it was based upon this fundamental discovery in the late 1950s. I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the late 60s, and I was a pre-medical student, a zoology major. It prepared me well for medical school, but a lot of what we learned was outside of the classroom because the Vietnam War was going on. There was a strong anti-war movement. We participated in it, and you can see some of the photos from that period. What I learned was that if you have strong convictions, you can't just sit around and let things happen. You have to stand up for your beliefs. And I've tried to be consistent with that all my life. In 1970, I enrolled in the University of Illinois College of Medicine, west of the Loop in Chicago. And you can see at the top that this is my entry photo. It looks more like a wanted poster. I had a lot of bushy hair then. And if you look down below at my 50th reunion celebration last fall, you can see I have a lot less hair. It's a different color and it's much shorter. I'll also call your attention to the guy on the right. His name is John Sandberg. He was my best buddy in medical school. He had a long, distinguished career as an emergency room physician in Oregon, and then he retired, and now he has what I consider my dream job. He plays guitar in a rock and roll band. I will also call your attention to the lower left corner. This is a shot of the baseball park, which stood on the grounds of my medical school before they built the medical school, Polk and Wolcott in Chicago. I found out because when I went to my reunion, I passed by a plaque on the wall of the building that said that this is the exact spot where the Chicago Cubs won the 1908 World Series. So little did I know for those 4 years, I was on hallowed ground. In 1974, I did my medical residency at the University of Minnesota. I was there from 74 to 77. The University Hospital and the VA. I'll also say that the VA was a place you always wanted to be on overnight call during holidays because the veterans of Minnesota were hunters and they would go out and bag wild game like venison and pheasant and they'd serve it to the veterans, and if we were on call we get to eat it too, which is a nice perk. I will also call your attention to my ties. Okay, this when we were residents, we made peanuts. They paid us like graduate students. And so we couldn't afford ties, so we had to buy our own ties. And this happens to be a tie that my wife made for me. She made all my ties in those days. It's pretty horrific, but these are my ties. I can also tell you that once I went into practice, when I could actually afford to buy ties, I would have several patients who were so horrified by my taste in ties that they would actually buy me ties as presents. And then there was a study that came out where they did cultures of doctors' ties, and they found that there was such a high level of dangerous microbes that, because of course, who would ever dry clean a tie? And when I saw that study, I just gave up wearing ties altogether. During the middle of my internship, we had our first daughter. And I can tell you that if you want to do an internship, try not to have a baby in the middle of it. I remember being tired a lot. I don't remember getting a lot of sleep during my internship, but apparently I got some. My wife has also commented that these are dangerous positions in which to hold a sleeping baby. So I want to tell you one anecdote from my internship. My resident and I had a case. It was a patient with something called Wegener's granulomatosis. It was a vasculitis, inflammatory condition of the blood vessels. It was highly lethal. There was no real proven treatment. And so we looked up the medical literature and we saw a recent review article published by Dr. Sheldon Wolf, who was head of one of the institutes in the National Institute of Health, and a colleague. And so we called the NIH lab that he worked at, and we asked if we could speak to Dr. Wolf for advice. And the secretary said, well, Dr. Wolf isn't available right now, but would you mind speaking to his junior associate, Dr. Fauci? We said, oh, sure, we will. So Dr. Fauci came on the phone, and we talked about the case, and he gave us advice. He couldn't have been nicer. It was very helpful. The patient actually did very well. So then, 12 years later, I am now doing AIDS work, and I'm in meetings where Dr. Fauci gets up and explains all the complicated processes that go into the cause of AIDS. And he also later became a champion for the early release of promising drugs to patients, which is actually, I'm convinced, saved a number of my patients' lives. And I am just appalled by the abuse and the threats that Dr. Fauci has received because, frankly, as a country, he has saved our ass many, many times. So when I finished my residency, I took a job with an internal medicine group in Milwaukee, Internal Medicine Specialties in downtown Milwaukee. Worked there for 17 years, 77 to 94. And I had several partners, Herb Becker, Mitch Jacobson, Sanford Mallon, all of whom were great mentors to me early in my career. And then at the hospital, Mount Sinai, I also had great mentors. The head of general medicine, Tom Jackson, the head of medicine, Rick Rieselbach, and these were giants in the field of social medicine and the delivery of healthcare to the underserved. And I've tried to model my career after these physicians. Now, this very busy slide, and I don't expect you to read it all, just lists some of the medical advances since 1977. There have been a huge number of innovations and major advances and breakthroughs. And I just, off the top of my head, listed some of them that I thought were important to my work. And you see things like revolution in imaging, ultrasound, CT scanning, MRI, laparoscopes, endoscopes, robotic surgery, stents, sequencing the genome, genomic medicine, electronic medical record, telemedicine, new vaccines, particularly mRNA vaccines, and the shift from small private practice to large integrated group practice. All these occurred during the time I was in practice in medicine. And in addition, when you look at on the right at the common medical conditions that we treat, the standard drugs for every one of these has changed completely during the time I've been in practice. And so what I learned is that you have to have an open mind to innovation and change. And yet you have to have a healthy skepticism about it. But also you have to follow the science and the evidence. And one thing I'm very concerned about is the major cutbacks to scientific and medical research funding are going to lead to a stalling of these innovations, possibly even a regression or other countries doing what we could be doing. And I'm very concerned about that. And I hope that as a government we come to our senses and keep the progress going for medical research, because all of this rests on research. So this is a list of some of the infectious diseases that were discovered since I became a doctor, from Lyme disease and Ebola, Legionnaires in the 1970s, to AIDS and HPV, H. pylori, hepatitis C in the 80s. And then in 1991, ehrlichiosis, I actually saw the first case of this in Wisconsin. It was a guy who got in tick bites in Florida and came back with it. And then, of course, avian flu, SARS, COVID, Mpox. And again, you just have to keep open to new diseases and things that we don't quite understand yet. So when you start medical school, they tell you that half of what you will learn in medical school will turn out to be wrong. What they don't tell you is which half. And that's what you spend your whole career trying to figure out. So in 1977, when I started, the conventional wisdom was that for high blood pressure in older patients, a normal blood pressure on the systolic side was 100 plus age. So in my case, that would have been 176. Now we know that that's ridiculous, but the reason we know is because there are a number of studies that changed that and got progressively lower in terms of what we should be shooting for. 2000 under 160, in 2015 under 130, and now we really shoot for a systolic blood pressure ideally in the 120s with whatever drugs will achieve that. And I can tell you that following these guidelines and putting this into practice, I have probably saved more lives and saved more people from heart attack and stroke than anything else I have done in my career. Probably second to that would be helping people quit smoking cigarettes. In 1970s when I started, we knew that peptic ulcers were caused by stress, which caused a lot of stomach acid, which burned a hole in the stomach. But then in 1984, a doctor by the name of Barry Marshall took somebody's ulcer and he mushed it up and he drank it, and he got a whopping case of ulcers and almost died. And he discovered that what he was drinking was a bacteria called H. pylori, which is the cause of ulcers. And now standard treatment for ulcers is now antibiotics plus acid blockers. And we can actually cure them, which we really couldn't do in the past. So when I first went into practice in 1977, I joined a group that was doing medical coverage of brewers. Our group did the internal medicine coverage, and we work with the orthopedic group. And so I would go to about 10 games a year to cover the team and the umpires and coaches. And before and after the game, I would check into the clubhouse. Did this for about 4 years. And I remember the first time I went into a major league clubhouse, it was Boston Red Sox. And I go in there and I see all these famous baseball players. And one of them looks at me and he says, "Are you really a doctor? You look like you're in high school." And I can tell you that I did not at that point feel like I was in high school. I felt like I was in kindergarten. You know, this is what they call the imposter syndrome. Like, should I really be here? Well, I got over that. I realized that these are just young men who occasionally would get medical issues, and I did it for a while and had some interesting experiences. And then they actually had a really good teams that year and actually went to the World Series. But then I got away from it, and then in the late 1990s, um, I volunteered to help the baseball commissioner, Bud Selig, because I, at that point, had patients with AIDS who were losing all their muscle mass. They were wasting away. And we knew that if we gave them anabolic steroids, we could grow some normal muscle. So I knew that steroids worked, and I knew that there was a downside to steroids. And so I said, look, I can help you. And he took me up on it. And I became a representative of the commissioner from his office to Baseball Health Committee. And I helped them out with some research that they were funding. Like there was a study of one of the steroids they found in a slugger's locker. And it turns out it was an effective steroid. I helped prepare background material for the commissioner's testimony before Congress. And then ultimately, baseball did get a drug testing and treatment agreement, which turns out to be probably the best in all professional sports. And I have to say that even though I played a very small role, I've always loved baseball. And to think that I played some role in cleaning up what was getting to be a dirty sport is a really satisfying feeling. So after all this, I asked the commissioner, I said, I have a very modest request. I love the Brewers, I always will, but I'm a Chicago boy. I grew up with the Cubs. I come from a family of diehard Cub fans. And, the Cubs haven't won the World Series since 1908. They haven't been to the World Series since 1945, before I was born. So do you think there's any way you could just kind of make sure the Cubs get into the World Series in my lifetime and I could be there? And he said, well, we'll see. And so here's 2003. The Cubs won some playoff games, and they got to Game 6 of the championship series. And here I am with my colleague and fellow Cub fan Fred DeBow as bleacher bums, and everybody was ready to party. And of course, that was a Bartman game, and they were 4 outs away, but they blew it. We went back the next night. I brought some other Cub fans, my dad, my daughter, my future son-in-law, and they lost again, so it was not to be. And I can tell you that I did get to the World Series that year. Unfortunately, it was in the usual place, Yankee Stadium. But I did get to go to the game with the commissioner, and my cousin and I went in this group of limos that they were taking down the East River Drive into the Bronx with a police escort, and it was so exciting, and we went into the game. After the game was over and the World Series was over and the commissioner had some things to do, like present a trophy, my cousin and I decided we wouldn't wait around, that we would just take the subway and go back to his apartment in Manhattan. So we think that we were probably the only people in the history of Yankee Stadium to come with a police escort and to go home on the subway, in distinction to many, many people who come on the subway and leave with a police escort. Now, at long last, 2016, you all know the story. The Cubs won the playoffs. They got into the World Series. Here I am with my cousin, my wife, my brother, my grandson. They won. It was so exciting. They won the World Series. Now, some of you may be thinking, is it possible that the commissioner could have fixed or arranged things so that the Cubs could get into the World Series and I could be there just for me? And the answer is, of course not. Well, first of all, by then he was retired. But second of all, if he could do something like that, I assure you, it wouldn't be the Cubs. It would be the Brewers. In 1981, there was an article that appeared in the CDC Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report in June and later in the New England Journal of Medicine in December about a strange new disease affecting gay men, people who use drugs. They would get terrible opportunistic infections and cancers and die. I get New England Journal every week, but I'm sure I didn't even read the article. I don't remember even noticing it. But then a few years later, I would be talking to my brother, who was a neurology resident in New York City, and he would tell me what he was seeing. And this was young men in Greenwich Village, where he was doing a rotation, who would get these brain cancers that would just rapidly progress and kill them. They would get severe, weird meningitis and other things that he'd really never seen before. And he said they call this GRIDS, gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome. So when I heard that, I just figured that eventually I would be seeing it. And I was right, because in April 1985, coming back from a meeting where we were told we would be seeing it, I started seeing AIDS cases myself. Coming. So then in April of 1985, I just gotten home from a medical meeting where they talked about AIDS and that if we hadn't seen it, we would. And sure enough, I started seeing cases. So one of my early cases was a guy by the name of Larry Kale. Larry was an actor. He was in the professional acting program at UWM and had a whole group of supportive colleagues around him. He was very upfront about his disease. He came to see me with symptoms. We diagnosed him with HIV and then later AIDS. He was the first person that I took care of from the moment of diagnosis until death 3 years later. He was a hellion. Typical story. He'd be in the hospital. A couple of his friends would come, his actor friends, and they'd be dressed up as gypsies, and they'd give him a gypsy costume, and he'd put it on, and the three of them would go running through the hospital, and there would be a guy with a video camera coming running after them, and running after him would be a nurse because he was supposed to be in isolation. But Larry was a great communicator. He had a lot of class, and again, he was very upfront about his disease, and so we became education partners. And he went to Nicolay High School with me. This is where my kids went, and where I was a medical advisor. And he talked to the kids about the reality of having AIDS. To the kids, it was just something you see on TV or reading the newspapers, but he made it real to them. He also went to youth group meetings with me, and actually a National Reformed Jewish Biennial meeting he came to because I was on the Reformed Jewish AIDS Committee. He also had such a weird opportunistic case of shingles that my colleagues and I presented it at the International AIDS meeting in 1987 in Washington, D.C. Here's our abstract. So Larry did die of AIDS, and here's a memorial service. I actually eulogized him. But one thing I noticed during his care was that there were these pair of home care nurses, Mary Buslaki and Karen Ivantek, who were just really great. They were extremely dedicated, they were compassionate, they were resourceful and very bright. And they did things with him and with a number of other patients after Larry that I just didn't know about in terms of innovative home care and hospice level care. And after a while, we realized that we were a team. Also, Cindy Vian, the hospital chaplain, was part of our team. Gary Hollander, a psychologist. And it really helped to be a team because this is somewhat isolating. What we were doing was so far apart from what most of my colleagues were doing that it felt kind of lonely. But we did have our team to support us, to prevent us from all getting burned out, which is really, really helpful. And Mary and Karen would go on to be very important to me later on in my career. So getting involved like that in HIV and AIDS, I began to see ethical issues come up on a regular basis. And one of the most important was that some healthcare professionals were afraid of getting infected themselves and refusing to take care of these patients. And so I would be on panels at churches and synagogues and so forth. And as I said, I joined the Reformed Jewish AIDS Committee, and we go to meetings. So this is a meeting in 1989 in San Francisco. And we, on a Saturday morning, Shabbat, we were taken over to the it's a it's a Jewish congregation, open Jewish congregation in the Castro district of San Francisco, Shahar Zahav. And we went in there, my wife and I, after being at our regular meeting, and we look at the walls. And typically in a synagogue, you see plaques for old people that died of old age-related things. But these plaques were all young men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and it was clear they'd all died of AIDS. And it was also clear that many of them had been ostracized by their own communities, their own Jewish communities, and that they found sanctuary in the Castro and San Francisco, also literally sanctuary at Shahar Zahav. And it made me feel somewhat ashamed, but it also made me feel proud because Reform Judaism was at the forefront of acceptance of both gay people and people with AIDS. And I was very happy to be part of that. In 1993, spring of 1993, there was a major screw up at the Southside Water Filtration Plant in Milwaukee. And it caused a parasite called Cryptosporidium to get into the water supply. And about half of the population got sick with diarrhea from Cryptosporidia. Now, great majority of these people had diarrhea for a while and they recovered completely because their immune system couldn't handle it. Our AIDS patients could not handle it. And if they got crypto, they got sicker and sicker, and many of them just could never get rid of it and died. They died of terrible diarrhea, they died of biliary complications, and it was just a terrible year because we had patients who were very immunosuppressed. We didn't have effective treatment for the HIV, and they were vulnerable to just anything that came along. And so we had the most deaths during that year of any year I can think of, and it was really a horrible year. And so at the end of it, we look back, and between my practice and another practice on the south side, we realized that we had the largest experience of people with AIDS getting exposed to Cryptosporidia at the same time. And we submitted this to the International AIDS meeting in Japan and got accepted in 1994. So I gave a presentation in Yokohama about this. And what I can tell you is that bottom line is that at that point, the people with AIDS with their immune collapse were the canaries in the cage for environmental disasters, particularly for water pollution. I would like to talk a little bit about one of my most memorable patients. His name was Tom Zander. He was a young, very successful attorney who was head of the Legal Aid Society. He'd argued a very important Supreme Court case on the rights of the mentally ill and won. And he came to see me in his early 30s in 1986 with advanced AIDS. He was wasting, he had thrush, he was really not doing well, and his outlook was very poor at that time. But he was very bright, very motivated, very interested in doing his own research and collaborating with me, which we did for many years. And we ended up doing just-in-time therapy time and again, doing things that mostly worked out. And he ended up doing quite well. He survived 2 partners. He retired from law, but then went to graduate school, got a PhD in psychology, and practiced as a forensic psychologist. He is now married, lives in Florida. Recently came to see me for his last visit with me before my retirement, before going on to a new doctor. And he and his husband recently attended my retirement party. And it's just amazing to me that this could happen, that somebody could be a long-term AIDS survivor for almost 40 years. But that is the case with Tom. Um, One interesting thing is that he bought, he sold a viatical. This is selling your life insurance to a company that buys it at a steep discount, holds a policy, and when that person dies, then the company will collect the full value. So for somebody who has a terminal prognosis, it's a pretty good deal. So he sold his viatical, cashed it out, and I got a call to verify this from the doctor for the insurance company, Dr. Silverman, who happened to be the public health officer of San Francisco during the early 1980s. So he certainly knew about AIDS. He said, "What is this patient's prognosis?" I said, "Prognosis? Negative numbers. He should have been dead a long time ago." So he got his viatical. And of course, many years later, he's still living and doing well. The company that bought the policy is still holding it, waiting for it to pay off, which I find to be quite funny. So another patient is Arnie. So Bill T. Jones, probably the greatest choreographer and dancer in the United States, um, did a show, and he called it Still Here. And what they would do is go around to various cities, and they would have workshops for people with life-threatening or pre-terminal illness. And Bill would say to these people, "I want you to do a dance move that symbolizes your determination to live, to be here." And so Arnie went to this workshop, and he developed a movement. It was like he thrust his hand in the air and made a little hop forward. That was his thing. And so they did a show where these people would give their dance moves as part of the show. So we went to see it, and it was really beautiful, and it was touching. But it was also kind of funny because Arnie was a total klutz. So being Arnie, he insisted that he had to write the entire program for his memorial Shiva. Shiva is where that you get together after somebody dies and talk about their life. And he wrote this program. So I happened to come upon it in my junk collection downstairs. I'll read you some of the quotes. "Being terminally ill is such a bitch. I've noticed that healthcare people want you to do stuff, but it's stuff that they never have to do themselves. And dying with dignity, geez, I've come this far without any dignity. Why should I die with it? When I go, it will be kicking and screaming." That was Arnie. So in 1994, I started to realize that there was not much future in small private group practices, and I thought it would be better to join an integrated system. So my hospital, Mount Sinai, had integrated with St. Luke's and were establishing clinic practices. So I left my group and I went to Aurora Medical Group. Only 2 miles away from where I was practicing before, River Center, and still affiliated with Mount Sinai. And I was working with primary care doctors, Edie Lepgold and Fred DeBow, Rich Gross, and Dick Franklin, both of whom are deceased now, and Alan Daniel. Also, my medical assistant, Mary Reinders Bodart, was my medical assistant the entire 15 years I was there, which could be some kind of record. And then Mary Busalaki, who used to be my home care nurse and was by then working with my expanded access drugs for my AIDS patients, became my nurse at Aurora to do work only with the HIV and the AIDS patients, which was just huge because it really allowed me to do the work. And I was there for 15 years. Now I'm showing you this slide. Now this is the ultimate mark of excellence as a physician, the Milwaukee Magazine Best Doctors List. I'm showing it not to boast because I think I only got in a few times. This is one of the years I got in, and the person who wrote this article happened to interview one of my patients. And she says a bunch of things about me, most of which were very nice, blah, blah, blah. And then she says at the bottom, Dr. Gilston is not charming with everyone, and he has little patience with jerks, but he is highly respected by his patients. So I, I just came upon this recently, and I looked at this and I thought, God, I got a lot of really, really nice patients. Almost all of them. I have had very few jerks in my practice. And then I thought, well, maybe um, the jerks read this article and they decided to go somewhere else for their care. Who knows? So by the mid to late 1990s, this is a meeting I went to in Vancouver in 1996, where they reported amazing success with the three drug regimens uh, in stopping the virus and allowing people with AIDS to recover their immune systems and go on living. And since that time, things have really been much better. I mean, the patients have generally not gotten these terrible infections or cancers. They've gone on with their lives, and it became much easier to take care of and to live with. Um, However, um, we had the drugs, but what we really didn't have was the best strategy for using them. And fortunately, I was able to be involved in a very large study of the best strategy in which to use these drugs. So this is what they call the SMART study. And what they were looking at is the standard of care, the way we did things was we treated patients with drugs only when they seemed to need it, when their immune system was down. And once the immune system responded, we'd stop, and the immune system came down, we'd start again. So it was intermittent therapy off and on, off and on. We did this because, first of all, the drugs were very costly, so the less drugs you use, we thought the better. Also, we thought there'd be less drug side effects and toxicity if we used less of them, versus just putting patients on drugs and just leaving them on. And they looked at those two strategies. And fortunately, I was an investigator, enrolled about half a dozen patients in this very large study. And what they ended up finding out was that the continual drug treatment arm, the ones that just went on drugs and stayed, did much better than the people on intermittent treatment. They had fewer infections, fewer cancers, many fewer deaths, and they also had fewer side effects than the people on continued drugs, even though they were getting overall less drug. But they also had much less heart disease, much less kidney disease, much less liver disease. And we now know that what's happening when you continually suppress this virus is you decrease inflammation. And it's inflammation that can really do a lot of damage to many organ systems, including your heart, liver, and kidneys. And that's the explanation for that. And we know that not just improving immune function, but also controlling inflammation is what we do with our modern treatments. And based on this study, and I tell you, of all the things I've done in my career, nothing makes me prouder than being part of a contribution to a new standard of care and a new knowledge and disease that I care very much about. So in the early 2000s, um, we had effective therapy for our patients, but it was quite clear that in much of the rest of the world, particularly in developing countries, they did not. And they were still seeing the horrible complications that we gotten beyond that we had used to see in the 80s. And so I was at a meeting in 2002 in Barcelona, and one of the other people at the meeting was Karen Ivantik. Karen, you remember, was one of my home care nurses who went on to become a nurse practitioner, work in the Mount Sinai AIDS Clinic. She spent a year and a half as a nurse practitioner in rural Uganda and saw many, many AIDS patients there. And was a nursing professor at Marquette and specialized in teaching an HIV/AIDS course, and actually had some nurses come from Africa to take her course. Well, I had nominated Karen for the advisor committee on AIDS called PACHA when George Bush became president, and she got accepted to this committee. And on that committee, she was a force for international effort, really pushed it. And so Karen was at this meeting as an official representative of U.S. government, And Karen and I, one night during the meeting, we met with some of her Kenyan nursing colleagues that she knew through Marquette. And we, Karen was aware that there was going to be, very likely to be a program of supplying retroviral therapy to developing countries, a program which actually the following year became the PEPFAR program. And we were telling these colleagues that this is going to happen. They were going to get these drugs, and we would be happy to help them to be able to use them properly. And so these nurses, they said, no way, yeah, we're not going to get these drugs. They were very skeptical. However, the following year, 2003, PEPFAR passed. These drugs became imminently available, and a group of Kenyan nurses came up to Milwaukee to take Karen's course, and the following year, Karen and I were invited to Kenya to help. So Kenya in 2004, 31 million population. The prevalence of HIV in Kenya was about 7%, which is over 20 times the prevalence in the United States. At that time, life expectancy had gone down 15 years from 60 to 45, and they were in big trouble. So here's a map of Kenya with Nairobi in the interior, Mombasa on the coast, Voi about 2/3 of the way down towards Mombasa on the Nairobi-Mombasa road. And Karen and I went. So this is my first talk in Mombasa. So got thatched roof, open air classroom. There were chickens and goats wandering in and out. I was afraid the electricity would go out at any minute and I wouldn't be able to project my PowerPoint from my laptop. But the people were so grateful, so interested and appreciative. And it was just really a wonderful experience to just be able to do something like that. Next, we went to Voi in the interior, and among other things, we went to a support group and I staffed a clinic. And so one after the other, they would bring in these people with AIDS. And this was a woman who had some complications and she was not doing well, kind of wasted and infections. And she looked like she was probably pre-terminal. And I'm smiling here, but I was really sad because I was frustrated that I couldn't do more for her except maybe recommend that she take some Bactrim. But overall, it was a day where we could see that the PEPFAR drugs were not in Voi yet. They weren't available to them yet. But then when we went to Nairobi and we made home care rounds with one of the nurses, we saw some of the first patients in Nairobi, in fact, in Kenya, to get PEPFAR drugs. So here's the 3-drug effective combination. Here's a man and his wife. He'd been on treatment for maybe about a month. But you could see how skinny he was, bones showing through, that he had what we call slim disease and also had TB as a complication of his AIDS. And his wife was very happy that he was getting therapy, but he wasn't feeling very well. And it turns out that the next day we saw him in clinic and he went to the hospital and he died. And what we subsequently learned is that what he had was something called iris. When he gets treatment and his immune system is completely wasted and it starts to come up, it attacks the infections he has, like TB. And it's an overwhelming inflammatory response and it's lethal. And what was learned from patients like this was you can't wait until patients get near end stage before doing effective treatment. You have to start as soon as possible. And that changed the policy. So the PEPFAR drugs then would go to anybody who was HIV positive as soon as they were diagnosed. And the outlook has become much, much better. Many, many lives saved. So Karen and I were invited back to Kenya 3 years later in 2007. By this time, We were able to find donors who got them a vehicle in the Voi clinic so they could really expand their reach. That clinic covered a vast area in South Central Kenya, and they could go large distances to pick up their patients, to take them to clinic, to take them to support groups, to get their nurses out and the community workers to see the patients. And so it really dramatically expanded their reach because there was no public transportation we're speaking of in that area. Karen and I were both featured speakers at a Kenyan AIDS Nurses Conference in Nairobi, and then I was able to meet with the Doctors Without Borders group in Kibera, a big slum in Nairobi, and we traded cases, and it was really interesting to see how similar the problems that we were dealing with, and despite our different environments. I also was invited to Nairobi Hospital to give a grand rounds and also to speak to the medical students and meet with them later at the University of Nairobi Medical School. And these, I realized, were the doctors that were going to carry the treatment of AIDS in their country into the future. And these are now, obviously, the seasoned clinicians who are doing the work and doing really beautiful work. Then there's Sister Jen Michelle, who was the head of the clinic in Voi, and you can see she's got some drug company swag because by this time retroviral drugs and the PEPFAR drugs had come to Voi and they were using them. So Sister Jem took me up into the hills near the game park in Voi, and we see this lady, and she looks at me and she says, "Dr. Gilson, so nice to see you again." And I look at her and I realize that's the same woman that I showed you 3 years ago in that clinic who's dying. And now she's feeling pretty good, looks pretty good. This is what we call the Lazarus syndrome. She'd been on therapy and she made a recovery and she was doing quite well. So you take this patient and you multiply it by 26 million and you get the idea for the impact of the PEPFAR program so far. What I really worry about is that PEPFAR program is under threat of defunding, and USAID, which is running the PEPFAR program, has been dismantled. And I really fear for the future of this program for the people who depend upon it for their lives. So this is a town near Voi called Maungu. I visited there a couple of times. Now Maungu is on the road from Nairobi to Mombasa. It's a major highway in Kenya. It's a major trucking route. And there's a truck stop near Maungu. And there's also a Maasai village near Maungu. And what would happen is very poor women in extreme poverty would serve as the truckers, and they would get HIV, and they would sometimes get it from their husbands. And this was a clinic in Maungu to serve these women, and they would get access to PEPFAR therapy. Their children would get treated, and pregnant women would get treated to prevent births of children with HIV. And a very effective clinic, very productive, and just shows you what the power of what the PEPFAR program can do. This is me with two Maasai women, and they actually knitted me. They weaved some jewelry for me, and that was how they made some subsistence income. So I came back a couple of years later, this time with my wife, and we met a group of women. Here they are, and on the bottom right is their social worker, and there's a guy also. And these women live as a community. They get their treatment at the clinic. They have some micro businesses out of their little community, and they're living because of the PEPFAR program. And it really worries me to think of what may be happening to this group of women as we go forward. But it was certainly wonderful to be there. They actually got us to dance with them, and I have a video of it, which I cannot show at this point. So in 2008, I was recruited by my colleague Frank Graziano, who ran the University of Wisconsin HIV/AIDS program in Madison, to be part of something we call the JCRC update. He worked with Dr. Peter McGenye, who ran this organization in Uganda, and he was the doctor who convinced George Bush and Tony Fauci and Tommy Thompson to do the PEPFAR program. He said, give us the drugs and we'll make it work. And in Uganda, they did. They were the test country, and they pulled it off, and that was really the proof of concept for PEPFAR. And Dr. McGenye and Graziano would go around the country training their clinicians, but they thought, well, why don't we have a meeting, a centralized meeting, and bring the people in our organization together to learn. And he recruited me as a faculty member. So we started this in 2008. We've been doing it every year since. The last 5 years have been virtual, but up until then it was in person in Uganda. Here I am, giving one of the talks to the first meeting, which was only about 40-something people. This was the last live meeting in 2019 where we had about 150. And in the virtual meetings, it's going into the thousands because people log in from all over East Africa. And what I tend to talk about is once you got the HIV under control, taking care of all the medical complications that they live with as they age. And for me to think in 1985 that in 2024 I would be talking about geriatric HIV care is actually kind of mind-blowing, but it's true, and that's what we're doing with these patients nowadays. We're taking care of aging patients living successfully with HIV. When I was at Aurora, there was a Salvation Army shelter, free clinic right down the road, just a few blocks away. And I volunteered there during the time I was at Aurora. Here's one of my fellow volunteers, Dr. Rick London. And it was only, a few blocks away, but it might as well have been a million miles away in terms of what we could offer because, the resources we offered were basically what we had available, which wasn't much. But I realized that it was better than nothing, and that you just had to use your head instead of all the tools that we took for granted. So I certainly learned a lot working at that clinic. And also, a number of the patients that I first saw at the free clinic ended up getting insurance, and I ended up following them in my own clinic. And a number of them followed me until my recent retirement, which is really, really gratifying. Now, in fall of 2009, when the Affordable Care Act was a bill trying to get through Congress, it was in trouble. They thought they were going to lose the public option. The whole bill was at risk of going down. And so a couple of my colleagues, Vivek Murthy and his wife Alice Chen, who are head of Doctors for Obama and then Doctors for America, called out the troops. They got doctors and medical students from every state in the country to come to Washington in their white coats. I was one of them, and stand up for the Affordable Care Act. Here we are marching down Pennsylvania Avenue together. There I am smelling the roses in the rose garden, meeting the president, listening to him speak. And we got a lot of good publicity. And right about that time, it seemed to get new life. And it ended up being signed into law on March 23rd, 2010. And it so happened that less than 2 weeks later, I happened to meet the president at the opening day of the Washington Nationals. And it's you see here, he's wearing a Nationals jersey, but really, he's a White Sox fan, Southside Chicago guy, and he was just wearing that to be polite to them. Anyway, so I showed him the pictures from the day I was at the White House, and he said he was really gratified that we were there. It was very helpful to him, helped get it through, and that was thrilling to hear, because in the 15 years that we've had the ACA, it has really changed things for the better in terms of access to care, and particularly in terms of the level of preventive care that we can offer our patients. So again, I'm one of the thrilling moments in my career that I actually could have been a part of this very important advance in healthcare. So in 2009, I realized that I soon might be wanting to step down in the intensity of my practice. I wanted to be with a more academic institution, and I joined Sargent Clinic and Fredericton Medical College. And these are those associates that I've worked with over the years I've been there, all excellent clinicians. And I'm really glad that I got to work with all these people. The Sargent Clinic, Frederick Hospital. And that's where I've been until my recent retirement earlier this year. Fortunately, over half of my patients from Aurora followed me over across town to Frederick, and even some of those patients had followed me from Jefferson Street to Aurora, so they made two care transitions with me, which is extremely gratifying. So at the time I came to Sargent, there had just been a Medicaid Badger Care expansion in Milwaukee, Governor Doyle, and there were a number of people who had no insurance for a long time, and suddenly they had health care coverage. So since I had openings in my practice, having just made the transition, I saw a number of these patients. And what was clear was these people were suffering from major medical neglect, many conditions that had left untreated and neglected, and we had a lot of potential to do some good. So I'm going to show you something, a clip from a NPR affiliate interview with me during this period of time.
And thousands like him could be dropped from the program next year if he makes too much money.
How have you been?
Dr. Ian Gilson is an internist who's been seeing a rash of new Badger Care patients like Vogel. He says many of them hadn't been to a doctor in years, although they suffered from serious conditions like diabetes and hypertension.
We got these people, for the most part, straightened out. We got proper lab testing. We got them on the right medications. Their diabetes improved. Their blood pressure came down. In some respects, they're actually feeling better. But we also knew that as we were doing this, we were preventing disasters down the road.
So on March 1st, 2020, my wife and I were in Phoenix, and we went to a Brewers spring training game. And we came home, and that week I started seeing COVID patients. And shortly after that, I was no longer in the office because I was doing telemedicine exclusively from home from April of 2020 till February of 2021. After I was vaccinated, my wife got vaccinated, I felt safe enough to return to the clinic. But while I was doing telemedicine and after I returned to the clinic, it was quite apparent that there was a tremendous amount of misinformation about COVID, about how it's transmitted, how to prevent it, about vaccines, about treatment, about precautions. And I did the best I could with patient-to-patient education, but then I realized that we had a public health obligation and we had to do more than that. So I started to do educational Zooms. So among them were one I did for the sheriff's deputies at the invitation of Sheriff Vernell Lucas. My wife belongs to a political action group on the North Shore, and I did a couple of talks to that group. And we are still trying to combat misinformation about COVID, and now the medical misinformation is at a whole new level with the disaster that we call the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So everybody's got, it's their favorite weird COVID story. Well, here's mine, upper right. So September of 2020, baseball commissioner calls me and he says, well, should I go to a Brewer game? I got invited, and what do you think? And I said, well, yeah, I suppose you should go, but as long as you take me along. So we went and we got tested before we went to the stadium. We get into the stadium and it's empty. We go up and there we were, commissioner and me, his personal assistant, the owner, his two dogs, the announcers, the umpires, the coaches, the players, and that's about it. And what you see behind me there, those little white things, are cardboard cutouts of fake fans. And there was also fake piped in crowd noise. And the game was going on down there, but it was just so surreal. It was really weird. But I have to say that being one of the only people to actually physically attend a baseball game that season, I guess I had to be satisfied. So in 1988, I was on a task force of state legislature, and the question was, should we do needle exchange to prevent the transmission of infections by people who use intravenous drugs? And those of us on the task force almost unanimously said the evidence is overwhelming. Yeah, if people are given clean needles to use drugs, you'll prevent HIV, you'll prevent hepatitis. It would be a really good thing, and we all voted to do it. The state should support it. One guy was against it. He was a very conservative DA from somewhere, and he said it's just going to promote drug abuse. He vetoed it. And the state did not do this program. And fortunately, private agencies stepped in and did it. And because of that, we've had much less drug-associated HIV and hepatitis than we otherwise would have had. But in the 21st century, there has been a steady increase in opioid use and opioid deaths, and this got even worse during the pandemic. And around about 2008, I realized from one of my AIDS patients who had a heroin problem that we couldn't really treat his AIDS effectively until we treated his drug problem. And around that time, a drug called buprenorphine or Suboxone became available. And this remarkable drug, when people were opioid dependent, it would stop their craving, it would stop their withdrawal symptoms, and it would stop their pleasure if they happened to do drugs. And so if they just stay on it, they could just resume a normal life. And I became a Suboxone prescriber, got on a list, accumulated a bunch of patients. Very few of them were HIV patients. They were just mostly young people who happened to get hooked sometimes on prescription opioids and ended up being physically dependent. And I continued to have a group of these patients until my retirement. And I can say that it's really been one of the most interesting and rewarding aspects of my whole career. And I will also say that these patients are very adherent because they know what happens if they stop taking the drug. And they are very grateful for getting their lives back. And these are some of the most stigmatized patients that I've ever seen. And I'm really happy that I was able to do this work. So this is a email that I got last year. It was really one of the best emails I've ever gotten. This is a former student of mine, Katie Chang. She was my student, M1, M2 student in 2021. And she is in 2024. She's getting her MD diploma. And she says she just graduated. I'm going into internal medicine residency at Kaiser in Oakland. I'm planning on becoming either a community hospitalist or primary care doc, and credit you with introducing me to the field. Many thanks, Katie Chang. Well, that not only made my day, it made my year, it made my teaching effort so rewarding because we are trying so hard to show our students that primary care can be an interesting career, a rewarding career, a really important career, and we need them so badly. So the fact that I was able to get through to at least one of my students makes me feel really good. I want to say a little bit about the one organization that I'm most proud of, and that is American College of Physicians. It's the largest organization to represent internists in the country. I've been a member since I started practicing in 1977. I made fellowship in 1997. I've gotten a number of peer recognition awards, Distinguished Internist Social Action Award, and this year I'm getting their highest award, the Laureate Award, which when I look at my predecessors who have gotten the Laureate Award is really a great honor, and I'm really looking forward to that. But the most important thing about being an ACP is I get to participate in advocacy. I'm on the Health and Public Policy Committee. I've been on it for many years, and this is advocating for policies that protect patients and protect science. And it's never been more important than it is now. And actually this fall, our committee is putting on a panel in our annual meeting on how to combat medical misinformation, which I'm really looking forward to. So, among the lessons I've learned in this career, here's one. They did some studies looking at how long it takes for doctors to interrupt patients after they start to give their story. And this is 1984. Howard Beckman studied this, and it turns out that doctors interrupted patients after about 11 seconds. Well, there's a lot of publicity about this. Many meetings looked at it, and they tried to say, we could be better than this. However, 15 years later, in 1999, they took another look, and that study showed an average of 11 seconds, no improvement. And I think what I've learned in years and years of relating to patients is to try to be a better listener. And I hope I've been able to do that. And finally, I want to share with you a gift that I received from one of my patients recently on his last visit before going to see another doctor. And he brought me this painting that he'd done. Now, this man had seen me about 30 years ago. He'd been my patient for all this time. When I first saw him, he had a serious condition. We addressed it, we treated it, he did really well, and he's really done very well for the whole time that I've been following him. And he gives me this painting. He said, I've done this for you. And I look at it and I said, oh, I didn't know you did abstract art. And he says, no, that's not an abstract. This is a painting of you and of what you've done for me. I go, what? I'm looking at it. I really don't see anything. And he points out the figure on the right. He says, that is a life preserver. And that's what you've done for me. And that just blew me away. But then when I thought about it, I realized that that's exactly what I had set out to do when I started practicing internal medicine many years ago. And that is to be a life preserver, to keep people afloat, to help people out in a meaningful way. And as I am looking back from retirement now, I think that I've done the job that I set out to do, and I feel okay about that. And I just want to say that my work would not have been at all possible without so many wonderful patients that I've had over the years. And I really appreciate that. And I thank you for helping make my career the rewarding one that it's been in so many ways. Thank you for watching.